Welcome back here with us on Times Now, and our focus continues to be on the latest coming from the United States of America. Prime Minister Narendra Modi is in the US. He is on a 3-day historic visit. As we speak, the bilateral between US President Joe Biden and Prime Minister Narendra Modi is currently underway. Earlier, when Prime Minister Narendra Modi reached Philadelphia, he had received a warm welcome from the members of the Indian diaspora. As he landed in Philadelphia just hours ago, members of the Indian community had gathered outside the hotel where Prime Minister Modi is staying, and they welcomed him with Modi Modi chants and some interesting, colourful and cultural performances. We are now getting visuals of Prime Minister Modi meeting US President Joe Biden. Before the bilateral talks between the two leaders began, there was a handshake followed by a hug. And then after that, it's going to be an important Quad summit. And for more on this, let me straight away go across to my colleague Siddharth, who is tracking the development live from Delaware. Siddharth, good evening from here. It's afternoon for you there. Tell us a little bit about the Quad summit that's now going to begin after the bilateral between Prime Minister Modi and US President Joe Biden gets over. What are the expectations? What is on the agenda?
Well, Hina, a very good afternoon to you from Delaware. The Prime Minister had left the DuPont Hotel. I'm standing right next to it as we speak a couple of hours ago. And of course, he met President Joe Biden at his residence not too far away from here in Wilmington in Delaware, which is Joe Biden's home state. Now, you spoke about the Quad. What a lot of people are also discussing, Hina, not just about the Quad, but also the bilateral that is currently underway between Prime Minister Modi as well as Joe Biden is Russia. Now, India's been on a diplomatic outreach over the last 3 months at the very least. In fact, and it's in that context that this particular visit on the part of the Prime Minister needs to be seen. He's visited as many as 6 countries since the month of July. He's been to Russia, he's been to Ukraine, he's been to Singapore, he's been to Brunei Darussalam, he's been to Poland, and he's also been to Austria. Our External Affairs Minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar, in the same time period has travelled to 10 different countries, and our National Security Advisor, Ajit Doval, very recently met President Putin of Russia, presumably communicating to him the outcomes of the interaction between President Zelensky of Ukraine and Prime Minister Modi when he was there. So Russia is going to be a very significant factor, the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, in the interactions that Prime Minister Modi will have with President Joe Biden, as well as the deliberations that take place as far as the Quad is also concerned. After all, these countries have taken a completely contradictory position in a certain sense, condemning Russia in categorical terms over the conflict that's currently underway in Ukraine. India has, of course, been on good terms with both the Russians as well as the Ukrainians. And, of course, these countries would therefore be looking to India as brokering as some kind of a possible solution or peace when it comes to this conflict that's raged on for more than 2.5 years right now. As far as the Quad is concerned, of course, China is always lurking in the background with respect to the Quad. However, you can expect that the agreement or the joint statement that's eventually released will never mention China in any explicit terms. India, of course, does not see the Quad as some kind of a standalone security alliance. India has been very cagey about entering into any kind of an armed alliance with any other country, even though the mutual interests might in fact coincide. India is looking at the Quad to expand its influence in the Indo-Pacific so that a rules-based international order can in fact be followed, something that China has been accused of violating consistently for an expanded and extended period of time. We can also expect the Quad to yield some kind of an outcome in terms of an infrastructure agreement between the 4 participating countries. Remember that China had actually initiated the Belt and Road Initiative in Kazakhstan and expanding to other countries way back in 2013. Can the Quad come up with some kind of an infrastructure arrangement in the Indo-Pacific to counter the Chinese influence there? That's one of the tangibles that a lot of experts are actually looking forward to. As far as the bilateral interaction that India is also expected to have, along with Australia as well as Japan. We'll also expect some kind of a tangible to emerge with respect to deepening the kind of cooperation we've already had in the Indo-Pacific region. So let's wait and watch. We can expect the Indo-US joint statement to be released as soon as that interaction between the Prime Minister and Joe Biden concludes.
And that joint statement will become very, very important. Siddharth, for the moment, thank you for joining us and bringing to our viewers all the details from Delaware. We'll keep coming back to you from for the very latest on this particular story. Let me also now introduce our guest joining us on the broadcast this evening. We have Anil Trigunyat, who is former ambassador, Spencer Critchley, who is a political analyst and author of Patriots of Two Nations, Why Trump Was Inevitable and What Happens Next. We also have with us Vibhuti Jha, ex-Republican candidate for New York Assembly. Appreciate all of you for joining us here on Times Now. Let me begin the discussion with you, Ambassador Trigunyat. Now, we've been speaking to a lot of experts today about, how important Quad Summit is going to be for India. And as my colleague Siddharth was also mentioning that, just before this visit of Prime Minister Modi to the US, he had visited Moscow. The visuals of the hug, the meeting with President Putin, were seen by the entire world. So the way, because of the ongoing conflicts, one, of course, between Russia and Ukraine, and second one between Israel and Gaza, the world seems to be divided. Amidst all of this, India has got a very, very important position, because India has managed to balance Indian interests and has managed to maintain a very delicate balance between both the sides. So amidst all of this, what are your expectations from Quad Summit vis-a-vis India?
Well, thank you, Hannah, and it's good to be with friends from the US. The fact is that Quad has emerged into a very major instrument of cooperation against a very severe challenge that the world is going to face in the Indo-Pacific. And India has always been talking about it and saying that this is something that one has to be careful so that the free and open Indo-Pacific can continue. And therefore, under President Biden, we have seen that the summits have indeed taken place from 2021 onwards, and this happens to be the sixth summit and the last one for him and Prime Minister Kishida. And therefore, it is apt that the visit has Prime Minister Modi is traveling there. Secondly, this particular Quad summit and the bilateral meeting between Prime Minister Modi and President Biden has taken place under very difficult circumstances where global governance is in complete crisis. As you mentioned, there are these two major wars. The world has not yet come out of the full impact of the pandemic, and then we had this Russia-Ukraine war, and then Israel-Hamas. All these wars have impacted the global South that Prime Minister Modi and India are the voice of. And therefore, the concerns of these countries will be done. Secondly, we see that Prime Minister Modi has been talking to all the world leaders, including President Putin and Zelensky. He visited Moscow and Ukraine and has been trying to help achieve some kind of a ceasefire or a roadmap that could eventually be out. And in that, the role of the United States is extremely important, because if the US wants it, it can move forward. And therefore, I think this is very important. Similarly, after his visit to Ukraine, he spoke to both President Putin and President Biden, briefed them. Recently, our national security advisor was also and he had discussed with President Putin what could be the specifics of this kind of program. So today, what we are looking at is, apart from the global governance crisis, there is a prevailing crisis which have a very specific possibilities of escalation into a very major conflagration, which would be good for no one. And so I think that this is important, very, very important timing for this summit and for the UN summit of the future.
Okay, the timing is very, very important. The expectations are also high. Spencer Critchley, what are you looking forward to given the current circumstances and what Ambassador Trigunyat mentioned?
For me, the key phrase in all of this is the rules-based international order. I think that the world is trying to negotiate still the transition since World War II from the era of colonialism or other forms of dominance by the developed countries of Western Europe and the United States, of course, into a world that is multipolar and truly pluralistic, and in which we don't maintain order through having some kind of a dominant relationship with other countries in the world. The United States has tried to avoid behaving like an imperial power, but because of its might, is often accused of acting in some ways like an imperial power. And I think that the key there is the rules-based international order. We can live in a world in which people have different national interests, different cultures, different languages, and are pursuing their own destinies, and at the same time cooperating without having to force each other to live according to every one of their own value decisions or to match up all of their interests exactly. And that becomes difficult still, though, when you run into an issue like Russia's invasion of Ukraine or the conflict between Israel and Palestine. And I think we see in some ways India and the United States are wrestling with similar issues in, on the one hand, not wanting to be in conflict with another leader, but at the same time, having to draw the line at behavior that isn't just a disagreement over values, it's a violation of the fundamentals of the rules-based international order, as, for example, with the invasion of Ukraine. And now, you know, President Biden is wrestling with our relationship with Israel, who is an ally as a liberal democracy, but with the terrible suffering in Gaza, there's a great deal of tension between President Biden and Netanyahu, for example, in Israel at the moment.
Right. So clearly, that's an important point, rules-based international order. And of course, there are many other issues as well that need attention at this point in time. I'd like to take that question across to Vibhuti Jha. But, you know, would just quickly go across to my colleague Malvika first, who's joining us live at this point in time, reporting live from the US. And we are getting some interesting pictures as well. Malvika, over to you. Could you describe these pictures? We can see Prime Minister Narendra Modi with US President Joe Biden. I think these pictures are just before the bilateral.
That's right. Prime Minister Modi received a very warm welcome at Biden's personal residence. The US has been terming this bilateral meeting as a meeting between friends and not necessarily a bilateral meeting in the true sense, but that doesn't mean that key issues were not on the agenda. National security was on the agenda. Issues related to Ukraine and Russia were discussed. The security apparatus in the Indo-China Sea, which is going to be a key issue of discussion at the Quad Summit, was also something that was discussed. But as you're seeing in the pictures, right behind you see a lake that is there behind Biden's personal residence, and he's sharing a candid conversation with the Prime Minister, who he terms as his friend.
Okay, interesting. Let me take that point across now to Vibhuti Jha. We can see these pictures, Mr. Vibhuti Jha, and as Malvika was mentioning, it's more like a meeting between friends, because this visit, this Quad Summit is also, in fact, has got a farewell note attached to it. So how do you see these pictures that we are now bringing to our viewers, the bonhomie that's on display between US President Joe Biden and Prime Minister Narendra Modi?
Thank you, Hina, for having me, and delighted to meet with my good old friend Anil Trugunayat, who was consul in New York when I was here too. So we have known each other for that long a time. Having said that, I personally believe that India and the United States are the world's two most prominent democracies. And we are the example and the beacon of hope for the rest of the world. And that's where this friendship, the pictures that you see here, form a very important scenario for that. Because if these two countries definitely take into account the rule-based order, but the rule-based order applied equitably to everybody. The challenge with the rules-based order is not the rules themselves, but the application and adaptability of the rules, depending on who the player is. So that is something that both these countries will have to uphold. Rules-based order, equitably for all, not for me and something for somebody else. That's the most important part. The second important part is that, the Quad is important. Indo-Pacific is important. China is critical for all the violations that they do and all the gamesmanship they indulge in. So this particular alliance, QAAD, is critical for maintaining some kind of a semblance of rule-based order. Again, back to the same theme. The other part which is very important is that Prime Minister Modi has somewhere along the line, in my humble opinion, has assumed a statesman-like persona when he openly, did not accept Ukraine as a global challenge or an Asian challenge. It is a European issue. Europe has a fantasy from time to time to indulge in their own, territorial adjustments that happen in that mainland. This time, Ukraine, nobody is buying it that it is anybody else's problem other than Europe's. And to that end, Prime Minister Modi has been forcing that hand, that unless and until we apply the standards of peace and prosperity beyond a global worldly rhetoric, we have to be serious about it. I mean, there is no denying the fact that Ukrainian people have suffered immensely. No denying the fact that Israel is suffering immensely, and so have Palestinians. I'm not talking about Hamas at all. So when we are looking at scenario, if we do not apply the rules properly, then countries like India and United States will eventually suffer most, because we will then be targeted by those who do not believe in rule-based order and those who use freedom as the fault line of democracy. And that's an important consideration to be borne in mind, that if you look at the position, you will find that those who are violating the rules are the ones who will not grant you any freedom should we have to live under their dispensation. And that's where the scenario is very critical for both these countries. As the leaders of the world, the largest and the most prominent democracies of the world, having so many plethora of similarities rather than divergences, these two countries have to work together and remove the obstacles and irritants between the interpersonal relationship between India and the United States. I think, in my opinion, that's very critical.
Okay, and I'd like to take that point across that you've made as far as rule-based order is concerned and the challenges that it also brings to Ambassador Trigunath. Now, this meeting is happening, this Quad summit is happening just few weeks before the big US presidential elections. And there are two candidates and the race is getting quite aggressive each passing day. We've got Kamala Harris on one side and we've got Donald Trump on the other side. We have seen how Donald Trump's administration has been in the US and his America First policy. We know many other countries, for example, Russia, China, they all keep their interests first above everything else. So if that is the mindset, and if we do see a Trump administration coming back, then what Mr. Vibhuti Jha has mentioned, do you think is possible?
Well, Hina, one thing is there. The primary objective of any foreign policy is to... And so when United States says that US first, or India says India first, or any other country says first, they're legitimate in their approaches. There's nothing wrong in it. As long as it is not going to exploit others, step onto other shoes, and that's where the international politics come to play, that you make friends. You iron out differences through dialogue and diplomacy. And that's precisely what India tries to do with all the countries. As far as rule-based order is concerned, and unfortunately, the rules-based order has also been flouted and violated by those very countries who established it in the first place. And there are umpteen instances, and I'm not going to recount here, everybody knows it. And so therefore, the credibility of enforcement or the countries that were supposed to enforce it have themselves balked at it. Even, for example, there are international agreements signed, and when you get out of those agreements, and when the administration changes, that causes a major destabilization in the world. And then you lose credibility. And that's precisely what something has to be avoided. As far as India-US relationship is concerned, I do not see any change. There is a pace that sometimes goes up and down, but the interests remain the same. India is a strategic pivot in the South. India is a voice of the global South. India is the fastest growing, largest economy, the largest democracy, as my friend Vibhuti said. So we have a lot to work together. We have the youth dividend that is going to be there till 2050, 2060. India has worked for the world. We have this policy of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. We look at the world not only in our own interest, but in the interest of the world, and we have proven it. We have not only talked about it on the paper. We are pushing the SDG agenda. We have held 3 summits of the Voice of Global South, with more than 120 countries in each one of them attending. The countries have confidence, and India's benign leadership, which is encompassing the global commons and the global goods. And that's how the whole situation in the Indo-Pacific comes to. So when in this particular summit, we are going to see a greater focus on Indian Ocean countries, whether it is a logistical agreement or whether it is the agreement on the IPEF, Indo-Pacific Economic Forum, or for that matter, the Indo-US drug framework agreement. Now, secondly, we'll also be seeing in this one something that is very important. That is that this is one organization in which you have seen that each country has its own priorities. Right. India does not believe in containment policies. There are others who are, Australia today is trying to normalize ties with China. US has changed its policy from decoupling to de-risking. Those all will come and change if there is an administration change in the US. So there will be a different situation, and we'll have to continue.
Okay. And I want to now go across to Spencer Crishley as well. One quick question. In your opinion, how crucial is Prime Minister Modi's visit for the US elections, given the Indian diaspora, which is not only substantial, but even very, very significant?
Oh, I think quite significant, both because it's a very large segment of our population, relatively speaking, and also an often very influential one. Like many immigrants, Indians who have moved to the United States tend to be very motivated to make good lives for themselves and their families here, and they very often succeed at that. And I think also many Indian immigrants in particular have the advantage of coming with a good education, which prefers them very well as often very good English skills. And so it's perhaps not surprising for those and other reasons that we see Indians leading some of America's largest companies, such as Microsoft and Google, and also being very successful investors and in many walks of life, and including just running neighborhood stores and all the way down the line. So I think for all those reasons, the role of the Indian diaspora is quite important in the upcoming election. And I am aware that Prime Minister Modi sees the diaspora as very important as well, which would explain his visits when he comes here. I would also like to note in the context of the upcoming election that I think this too ties into the importance of the rules-based order. If President Trump happens to be reelected again, then I would see that as a very serious threat to the rules-based international order, as well as the rules-based domestic order here in the United States, since he is essentially bent on behaving as an authoritarian whose authority is derived from a cult of personality, so that everything that he does is right simply because he chooses to do it, which is, a pre-modern worldview, much more like an absolute monarch like Louis XIV than it is like an American president. And so I think that is one of the very serious threats that both the United States and other countries around the world are facing, because if he is reelected, other countries will be forced to deal with somebody who already has shown himself to be impulsive and mercurial, to abandon agreements that were apparently solid. And I think it's certainly has to be on the minds of the participants in the Quad.
Right. Interesting. So the outcome of the U.S. elections, of course, is going to be very, very critical given what comes out of the Quad summit later tonight. I appreciate all of you. Thank you very much for joining us here on Times Now and sharing with us your perspective on this very important summit that's going to happen. Let me also now quickly go across to my colleague Siddharth, who is live with us. Siddharth, now we have got the first tweet as well from Prime Minister's office on the way Prime Minister Modi was welcomed earlier by US President Joe Biden. And very quickly, I wanted to understand from you, amidst the Russia-Ukraine crisis, Israel-Gaza crisis, there is a lot that has happened in Bangladesh. Do you think even that is likely to be discussed, during the Quad summit? Any word on that?
Well, Hina, that's a very good question. It remains to be seen as to whether or not that comes up for discussion. But India's neighborhood has been an inevitable point of discussion when it comes to bilateral talks between India and the United States. In fact, if you go through the joint statement that was released in 2023 when the two leaders met, back then, of course, there was a commitment on the part of both India as well as the United States calling upon countries like Pakistan to not use its territory for terrorism against India. Regional stability has been a very important consideration for both countries whenever the two have met. What's also made the neighborhood that India is part of that much more complicated and problematic is what's been happening in Bangladesh and, of course, the withdrawal on the part of the Americans from Afghanistan 3 years ago, again under the Biden presidency. So has that left the entire neighborhood that much more volatile? That's a question that many Indians have been asking. Bangladesh, of course, continues to remain quite tense. There's now an interim administration in place there, but Sheikh Hasina's presence in India is something that is an issue for the administration there that they've taken up bilaterally with India. Whether or not that features in the discussions between Prime Minister Modi as well as President Joe Biden remains to be seen. Whether that takes a formal inclusion in the joint statement is something that we'll have to wait and see. It could presumably be brought up informally when there are, of course, back and forths between both the Prime Minister and the President, when general issues and discussions are being raised over the state of India's neighborhood. Has it become more volatile in the recent past, which it inevitably and undoubtedly, in fact, has? And that's something that you can, in fact, expect the Prime Minister to mention, at least in passing, with his American counterpart, if not by way of a formal inclusion in the joint statement.
So on the issue of overall regional stability, this could come up, especially in the bilateral between Prime Minister Modi and US President Joe Biden. So we will be coming back to you, Siddharth, for more on this. But for now, thank you so much for joining us with all of those details. And viewers, with this, it's a wrap. Thank you very much for staying with us here on Times Now. Heading into a short break, but lots lined up for you on the other side. Don't go anywhere.